On behalf of the motion picture industry, welcome to the world of home video entertainment.
A video nasty is a colloquial term used in the United Kingdom and Europe to describe a number of films which were distributed on VHS video in the early 1980s, which were heavily criticised by the press, Parliament and various religious organisations for their content which contained strong use of violence and graphic nudity. No legislation was in place to regulate home video content. This meant that any films on the market and available from video rental stores had no certification, although the Act did not govern home video at the time. At this time, the British Board of Film Censorship was established in 1912, only governed theatrical cinematic releases, and was not enforced to censor home video. This was due to a loophole within the film classification laws at the time. Because of this, in the early 1980s, the market was flooded with low-budget horror films featuring gore, violence and graphic nudity. Due to the video nasty debate in both Parliament and in the courts, this resulted in a number of films being prosecuted in the early 80s by the Director of Public Prosecutions. Following this, the government passed the Video Recordings Act 1984, which meant in Britain all video releases had to appear before the BBFC. These so-called video nasties caused an outright media frenzy during the early 1980s.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
In 1982, Vipco placed an advertisement for the Driller Killer in a VHS magazine. This advertisement served to bring the awareness of these types of films to the attention of the masses. What happens next was
censorship. Censorship.
I think it's important for us to define what we're talking about here at the start. This isn't the small type of censorship, say an adult trying to restrict the access of a small child to pornography. Something you could argue is in the best interest of someone who is not capable of deciding for themselves what's best for them or what is possibly bad for them. This is something different, this is something larger, this is something more insidious. This is a small group of people, a governing body of some type, restricting the access of the body of the masses to something that they want. These are people who can decide for themselves what's good for them or possibly bad for them, but you have this overreaching governing agency or government enforcing their own ideals, morals on the masses. This is where things get wrong. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about censorship within this context. The video nasties, the PMRC, the Satanic Panic, this whole era of restriction of music and film and art in general from the masses.
So if you were lucky enough to own a video player in the early 80s, you had unrestricted access to a number of violent horror, gore films, full of blood, full of gore, full of splinters going in eyes, full of drills going in heads, full of nudity, full of Nazis, full of everything. The video nasties are bloody amazing. They're very important for film history, and I don't think there isn't a filmmaker, horror filmmaker alive today who doesn't owe a debt to a video nasty. They are such a big part of our British culture and worldwide. They're a worldwide phenomenon.
Even the word nasty, what does it mean? At the time when that phrase was coined, it was considered an incredibly nasty, vicious, film with a lot of violence, usually sexualized violence. Women were the main target and victims in these films. And certain American films, I even find distasteful. The early Wes Craven, Last House on the Left, I Spit in Your Grave, for example, another film from that genre. which seem to revel in sexual violence, and it's something that I've never felt comfortable with. But whether those films should be banned or whether they should just have a warning on them is a controversial subject. Because if you talk about banning things, then you get into that area where, if you know Fahrenheit 451 essentially is the temperature at which paper erupts into flame. And that was, kind of exemplified as an example in that great film of the same name.
Pretty much everything on this list is known for its brutality. Movies like House on the Edge of the Park, it's got a lot of rape scenes, but they're also very violent in nature. The same thing with Last House on the Left. I think that's sort of in a lot of ways what makes these movies video nasties, it's just the nastiness of them all.
I know the actual New York Ripper was put up, and they actually escorted that film out the country because they didn't want anyone even making bootleg copies or any distributor getting hold of that film at all. So the New York Ripper was actually escorted out the country, which is really crazy.
But here's the problem censorship inevitably runs into, is that any time an art form, music, film, whatever is censored, that inevitably creates an underground movement. A collective of creative people that are inspired by the restrictions that have been placed upon them and seek to circumvent that and find new ways, new forms of expression, more extreme forms of expression, as a direct response to the unfairness of the censorship. And that whether it's hip-hop, whether it's punk rock, whether it's horror films, that underground movement eventually, because of that extremity, because of the interest and the rebelliousness of what they're trying to do, that outside group inevitably takes over the mainstream down the road and becomes the mainstream. So the real hilarious thing about censorship is, if you think about things that have been censored, from The Wolfman in 1941 to Friday the 13th to Where the Wild Things Are, it doesn't work. I mean, in the end, over the long term, censorship does not work, because eventually these things you're trying to suppress always get out there. Always. That's the irony of censorship.
Censorship.
There should be no censorship within films whatsoever except for children. Protect the children. That's it. It was a disaster for Britain to ban the movies in the 80s, like Mother's Day, Toxic Avenger, because what you got were you got a 40-minute version of the Toxic Avenger. It wasted people's money, wasted their time, and wasted very good art. There's no reason for any kind of censorship. This is idiotic.
So it means that what we're in danger of is throwing all of these films into a great conflagration and destroying them forever. And then a very valid part of our movie history is lost. So I think that's what the British government at the time had in mind when the list of video nasties emerged, where they decided, any film that any kind of graphic violence was considered beyond the taste of the British tastemakers, and because of that they decided that the public should not have access to them. And they became an illegal list whereby if you wanted them, and they still were available, you literally had to get them in a brown paper bag under the counter, and then take them home and bring them back in the same manner.
The story I heard was that the head of Go Video wanted to try and drum up some publicity for his film, so he sent a copy to Mary Whitehouse pretending to be an angry member of the public who'd come across this film in the video store, and he was hoping that she'd complain about it, and then that'll get people going out and buying it and stuff. But instead it had kind of a bit of a catastrophic effect on the video industry as a whole at the time, because then it kick-started the whole, Department of Public Prosecutions raids and making a list and getting the police raids. And so I think that was the kind of catalyst for the whole thing. But also at the time you had video magazines and stuff that would have full-page adverts for stuff like The Driller Killer and SS Experiment Camp and things like that. And this was all kind of the video industry didn't help themselves at the time.
But as you can see, from the list of video nasties, a lot of the films are, great Italian classics. You're looking at Suspiria, one of the great art movies of the late 20th century. You're looking at Tenebrae, another really beautiful but extremely violent film, which also had humor, as well as some of the most dramatic camera movements ever recorded in cinema history. You know, you had the films of Lucio Fulci, again, which are extremely violent zombie films. But they're zombie films. You know, they're not to be taken that seriously. Zombies are fantasy. As we can see now in the 21st century, one of the biggest shows, on the planet is The Walking Dead. Now, nobody's trying to ban that show, and it's far more violent and aggressive than anything that came out in the 70s and the 80s. So, again, I think video nasties were a product of their time and a kind of an ethos of the time of political correctness, where people felt that we need to safeguard the moral life of the viewer. It is fascinating when you look at the films on the list now. You're looking at The Evil Dead, and you think, well, now why was that film on a list of video nasties? Probably because there was, penetration with a tree branch. Basically, a woman was raped by a tree, and then you also had, a lot of scenes of aggressive violence. But again, that's what I think it was. I think when sexualized violence was included with the more mainstream horror violence, then it became a tricky area for the tastemakers in Britain.
Police and forces were going around removing these videotapes from video shops and burning them. It's totally crazy. You think it wasn't that long ago and this was happening. I mean, where would these bloody people be now? What would Mary Whitehouse do with the internet? Would she sit there going around every, webcam sex fucking website trying to censor that? What would she be doing now?
They wanted to get people buying their products, so they tried selling it in the most sensationalist way possible. And I think at the time there could have been more of like if they hadn't done that, maybe that we wouldn't have censorship, or censorship wouldn't have been so tough as it was. But they really kind of, in their need to try and get people buying their videos, they really went overboard. And because at the time when videos first came out, there wasn't any classification. It was all it was classed as like a publishing medium alongside books and music. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what would have happened with home video and watching films at home if the whole video nasty scandal hadn't happened. I mean, would it have gone down the same path as publishing mediums like books and music and stuff, or would the classification system be inevitable?
Well, my views on censorship as a whole is a tricky one, isn't it? Because I'm a libertarian. I believe in freedom of speech. We fought 2 world wars. Even the English Civil War was partly fought because of freedom of speech. John Milton actually wrote a famous pamphlet about speaking out against censorship, which I've read, and that's even now regarded as a classic. So even then, back in the 1640s and 50s, people were against censorship. The only thing, where do you cut the line? Where do you have that sort of that point where you think, well, this is too much?
I think censorship, it needs to be in place. I mean, there were definitely movies that I was watching when I was young that I really, questioned how I even got to do that. I really believe, some things just shouldn't be sent to young persons. You need to be mature, and you need to have life experience to be able to digest what it is that you're seeing, so that it doesn't affect you in a negative way. I'm still baffled that a lot of the stuff in America is unrated. I'm just kind of like, I would die if like one of my kids grabbed a hold of Cannibal Holocaust, and they were like 10 years old or something. I mean, it's kind of scary. So I think it's good in this country, in Australia, that we have pretty strict laws on the classifications, because it is appropriate, and there's some stuff that kids shouldn't see until their minds are formed.
I think you've got to have some boundaries with censorship, because I don't want to see sort of inappropriate material of children being put in films and that, because you can't have a free-for-all, I don't believe. So there's certain things which I don't think you should show, stuff with kids and that, but, other things like, people being killed on camera, not for real, of course. I mean, I'm totally against that, because some people even want to legalise so-called snuff movies, where people are actually being killed for real, and that should never be allowed. to happen in any civilised society, that those films should be made freely available, if they even exist, because some people say they don't, it's just a myth. So censorship, certain things are inappropriate, which I've already said, but on the whole, you can't have censorship for films like this, to be honest, because at the end of the day, it's just actors, aren't they? They're acting. Even if they weren't that good, some of them, it's just fiction. So people who want to ban all these films should get over it, in my humble opinion.
The idea of singling out films and saying that, I don't know, it's just absurd, the whole idea of censorship. In this day and age as well, particularly with the internet and
Censorship.
the idea that you can buy these things, and the fact that, you had films that were banned for years and years, and then they've all been released, and there's been no discernible effect on society. There's not been a sudden uprising in violence and crimes, and this is all the sort of things that Mary Whitehouse and Margaret Thatcher are trying to say these films are responsible for, when in fact, that it was her way of diverting attention from how badly she was running the country and stuff. And with Mary Whitehouse, I think she just wanted to make people follow the kind of Christian viewpoint of what she believed in, and horror films didn't really fit in with that.
So I've got a big thing about censorship. It really, it's not endorsed by anybody but myself, really, my views on censorship. We're at an age now where films are so accessible, the imagery is so accessible to anybody, so easy to get hold of. And I've also at an age where people know what is fake and what is real. They know how films are made, they know how special effects are made. It isn't like back in the day where you only had Fangoria to look at, look at behind the scenes. You know through Blu-ray releases and special features documentaries like we make that things are fake and how they're put together and the crews that do it. So saying that censorship is needed to protect people from imagery they shouldn't be watching, and also saying that by watching those films those people are affected and will do things they shouldn't be doing, I think is wrong, really, because I've watched horror films all my life, and I'm not saying it's one example, because I know people have issues, but when people do have issues regards to horror and do act out and do blame horror films, that are people who aren't exactly people in society that you want. The average Joe who watches a horror film understands its entertainment, understands how it's made, and enjoys it for what it is.
I agree, and I think that's why we've got certification of films.
But
I'm just saying that's what. I'm saying. Of course, that's why, right? It's how we interpret stuff. Okay, we're one of the fortunate few who were rightly brought up to have seen films we shouldn't have at such a young age. Against age restrictions, right? And we are two living examples among many who have seen these films and not one thing's happened, right? If anything, it's kind of you insist.
Wasn't a kid.
We were kind of, it's actually inspired us, right?
Yeah, I think
it's inspired us to do what we do now. We wouldn't be, we
wouldn't have met.
We wouldn't have met. For the love of horror. So, and there's a lot of people. Look at horror fans. When you watch all these making ofs, or you meet all these people, the actors and the talent behind these films, they always say what a wonderful crowd horror fans are. How loyal they are and everything. There's gonna be instances, I have no doubt, where people are affected in different ways. But you know what? It's not just with films. It's with anything, right? It's their social backdrop. Do you know what I mean? It's how they were brought up, etc. And also it's how the mind works, right?
We're also in a culture where we do blame people, and we blame.
A lot of films are scapegoats.
We blame things.
Child's Play 3, Jamie Bolger.
Exactly. We blame things to make our case stronger. The guy who blamed the Scream movies, the guy who for the killings what he did, the guy who blames Nightmare on Elm Street, and he said unfortunately the Jamie Bolger case in the UK, which is a big case, which obviously affected a lot of people in this country, and Child's Play 3 is suddenly banned. Child's Play 1 and 2 isn't. Child's Play 3 is, because the children said they'd watched that movie, and there are similarities between Jamie Bolger and Chucky. But you can't then blame the film for the actions of people who aren't, completely there. And I knew as a 10-year-old when I was watching those films they were pretend. I knew when I was 15 those films were pretend. And that the fact they are on the screen and they're made to entertain. Horror is one of the biggest entertainment genres around because people love to be scared. You know, it sells, horror sells now, and it's become so big with your Blumhouse.
I think that the two strongest emotions, the two biggest things you can react to is horror and comedy.
Exactly.
And it's a roller coaster ride, right? It's just a movie.
Don't look in the basement. The makers of Last House on the Left warn you again. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
Well, I think the whole censorship thing just backfired. I mean, it basically promoted to the curious. All it did was made everyone want to see these, and here it is 40 years later, and people are still talking about them and wanting to see what's all the fuss. And look where we are right now with all the re-releases on Blu-ray and vinyl releases, and I mean the supply and demand is there, and I just wish a lot of the filmmakers could see the popularity that it got, because they can finally get their due.
No, I do not think that these movies should be banned or put on any sort of list like this. I mean, you don't ban paintings, and they really don't ban books anymore. And I think that no matter how extreme the film is in its nature, it's still art. And I don't believe that art should be censored.
I don't agree that young children should be watching films, but watching violent films. You know, I don't think that a 5-year-old should be watching a Serbian film or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So in that way, I do agree that there should be some sort of classification system put in place, and that, you know, young children shouldn't have access to these sort of things. But when you get to the 18 certificate category, I think that unless it breaks the law, unless it's actually, you know, something illegal going on in the film, then the idea that any kind of censorship should exist is you know, stupid.
Censorship. Should video nasties be banned? Well, no, I don't think they should, because it's part of a cinema history, it's part of that genre. And if you ban them, people are just going to want to see them anyway, aren't they? Because history has shown whenever something's banned, people always want to find out why it's been banned and watch it. So no, they shouldn't be banned. And people are going to get them anyway, aren't they? You know, you've got the internet and YouTube and things like that. So no, they definitely shouldn't be banned.
I think some yes and some no. Some of the movies were quite gross. Others were probably more what I would consider an R rating, which you could stomach. Perhaps back in the 80s, it might have been really gross and sort of barbaric for some people, but I think definitely now you'll see some of the movies that were even an R rating then are now an MA rating. So they've dropped as we've been able to digest this sort of material more and more over the years. Ratings seem to drop. So yeah, I think at the time some yes, some no.
Do I think they should have been banned? It's hard to say that, really, because, you know, you're looking back 30 years and you're thinking, well, these are just movies. How could they possibly have offended so many people to think that they should be banned? But they were in parts of the world, and they were done because they feared, of course, that these would affect kids and impressionable viewers. And to a degree, you know, you can sort of see that that does make some sense. You can imagine a little bit like, well, you know, I'm sure there is a weird guy down the street who might watch this movie, and, you know, he might get an idea, and, you know, if he knocks on my door, well, I could get beheaded, right?
No, I don't think any of these films should have been put on a list for, you know, the people can't consume them, can't watch them. They're made to be consumed by an audience, and you know, they're made for adult entertainment. If anything, I'd say, you know, try harder to keep it out of the hands of children, I guess. But that doesn't fall back on really the filmmaker. That falls kind of on the parents and the people that are letting them see the films. You know what I mean? You have to be a certain age to drink and smoke and watch porno, you know what I mean? So, like, just throw something on that and get a little more strict with that if you want, but I wouldn't, there's no need to, you know, ban a film so nobody can see it, you know, unless people are actually being killed in the film for the sake of the film, you know, not so much like in a Faces of Death situation where it's supposedly documented death that, you know, it happened and it was caught on tape, so they'll make use of it that way, you know what I mean? But, you know, yeah, for the most part, it's all art, it's all entertainment, and, you know, it's not real. There's stories being told. They might be a little more gorier than, you know, Gone with the Wind and stuff, but that doesn't mean they need to be blacklisted, you know what I mean, and cut out of the womb of society so nobody could watch them.
When it comes to if I think the film should have been banned, you know, and put onto the video nasty list, I don't feel like they should have. I feel like, you know, they should have had warnings on the front covers of the videotapes that says, you know, this movie should only be viewed by people, you know, aged like 18 and up. You know, just should have had like really good warnings on the ones that really were shocking. Because the idea of like banning a movie, because honestly, when you ban a movie, all it really does is put more attention to the movie. It's kind of like if someone, like your parent says, you can't watch that. You can't see that movie. That's not something you should see. You should never see that. It makes you want to watch it more. Like I remember when I was in school, I remember there was a sheriff that came into, when I was in middle school, I think it was in the 6th grade, he came in and said, there's one movie you should never watch, and it's called Natural Born Killers. It's shocking, it's terrible, it has bad depictions of police, bad depictions of... He was going on and on and on about this list and about it again and again and again, continuously going on about Natural Born Killers. And you know what I did that night when I got back home from school? I immediately rented the movie.
You know, maybe you gotta go out of your way a little more to make sure that they don't go into the wrong hands, if that's what you're worried about. But I don't think you know, horror movies have ever really caused problems in the sense that they're thinking of killing people and stuff. I think that, you know, when somebody goes out and they kill somebody, they're killing somebody because they want to kill them. You know, I feel like whether they grew up watching, you know, Pound Puppies 24/7 their entire life, if it's in them to kill somebody, then they'll kill somebody. I don't think that, you know, watching The Beyond or Blood Feast is something that's gonna send them over the edge. You know what I mean? But I think all censorship in a whole is not a good thing. It's you know, people shouldn't be dictated to on what they need to do or what they need to watch, and, you know, what they can and can't do. Because I think people they have free will, and they should be able to make their own decisions. You know what I mean?
So I think, you know, banning a movie, all it really does is, you know, was bringing more attention to the movies. So making it so people were like, well, you're going to ban, I'm going to find some way to watch it. So, you know, it makes you, all it really was doing was making more and more people have to go out and find any way they can to sort out and find the movie. With bootlegs or anything that they could do, sending away for a copy from the, you know, US or anything. That's all it really did. So banning it, I really don't think that that was the way to do it. And I also really hate the idea of like banning something, saying you can't watch that. I don't know. I just really hate that, the concept of doing that to a movie and like censoring it, all that kind of stuff.
But should they have been banned? You know, you've got these films made. They are produced. They are funded by studios to be made. Sometimes independently.
I mean, a lot of them were done kind of quite rough.
I mean, a lot of them were European as well. They've been released in Europe, released in America, and been banned here. Now, it was obviously, we had a particular issue in the UK in regards to these films, and that obviously we mentioned before was BBFC, was Mary Whitehouse. So should they have been banned because of that? No, they shouldn't have been.
No.
They were banned because of an agenda from a particular political group or particular organisation who deemed those films to be inappropriate. They weren't banned because there was an uproar by the community and the public. Far from it. Actually, the public were drawn towards these films even more so because they were banned.
Well, and that's the thing. Ultimately, you know, I'm talking about all of this in retrospect, and course, obviously I wasn't there, but I like to think I've done my kind of research and watching, and so talk a bit about me maybe on this part, and us, our kind of experiences, right? Okay, so for me, I got into horror films from a very early age, and in fact, doing the story part now, my first encounter with a video nasty, albeit I didn't realise at the time, was the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And my old man, I'd actually seen part 2 first on a pirate Dutch video my dad had. And the reason I think we got into watching that was because I think I was helping him organise his vinyls, and he had the original soundtrack to Chainsaw Massacre 2. And the cover threw me straight away. Like, it was the Breakfast Club shot, which now you look at, it's absolutely hilarious. When you're a little kid and you see this hideous face with a chainsaw and the Nubbin's corpse at the bottom, it was terrifying. And we watched it, and I was entertained, I was terrified, but it was a memorable experience. And then not long afterwards, he dug out his original Ivor Film Services VHS box of Chainsaw Massacre, the original. It was just a silhouette of Leatherface waving the chainsaw around, and thrown all over the boxes, uncut, uncensored. It happened, completely sensationalizing the product.
Yeah.
And he popped it on, and I think I only watched the segment first. It was when Kirk runs into the house, and Pam does as well, and they both meet their demises. And so I'd experienced horror, but never on that level. And unfortunately, I think the bar was set then, and not much in the years since has had the same impact on me.
I don't really believe in censorship. I don't really see the point behind it, particularly in this day and age. It's but the BBFC's viewpoint has always been that they will ban something if they feel that it can cause harm to an individual or to society through the actions of an individual, which I think is just something which has just never been proved. It's just illogical. It's like saying, for example, if you take something like a gun is harmful. It's been proved to cause harm, so therefore we ban it. But when it comes to films, to say that some people might watch a film and go out and cause harm or whatever, while other people might not, is pretty much kind of proves that films don't cause harm. The way that people act in society comes back to the whole kind of nature-nurture debate. It's all about, how someone was brought up, their kind of, how they learned about ethics and morality, and how they understand their actions cause harm to others. Or it can be through the nature side of things. So if someone has some sort of mental problems, in their brain, if this is like caused through genetics or it's caused through, when I did psychology, I learned about how if someone's frontal lobe gets damaged, and that relates to their theory of mind and their kind of understanding of how, their actions causes harm to other people. These are the sort of things that make people go out and kill. If you've been brought up as a normal person, you understand the difference between right and wrong, you understand that your actions have consequences, and you understand the feelings of other people, you're not going to watch a film and then have all of those beliefs changed, or you're not going to... If I spent the weekend watching the film Reservoir Dogs, I'm not going to then go out on Monday and start cutting policemen's ears off. That's just not how human beings work. And so I think if a film doesn't break the law, if it's not like, child pornography or a real life snuff film, or it doesn't have animal cruelty in, then I don't think that anything should be banned. I think it's kind of absurd as well, the fact that we still have stuff like a Serbian film is banned, or the full uncut version, is still being cut. And yet you can go onto Amazon now and buy the full uncut Swedish release next to the BBFC approved version. I don't understand what these people are doing in their little Soho office, and it's kind of, it just seems a bit crazy, the idea that they still sit there and they still agonise over which bits to cut and which bits to leave in, and should we, is this okay? Should we have this shot here? Or it's as if like any of that really matters. It's like I said, going back to the and the other thing as well is you get films which were banned once and then have now been released, and their logic has always been that, well, society's changed and what was once harmful is now not harmful. And it's like, going back to my example of a gun, if I shot someone with a gun now, if we waited 20 years and then I shot someone, it wouldn't the fact that society has changed, or that that the world has changed, is still harmful. Whereas the idea of a film being harmful and then not being harmful, it's just illogical. And then, and we've got access to 24 hours a day hardcore pornography now, and we haven't got a society full of rapists and sex offenders as a result of it.
But I'll tell you what is the actual silver bullet is technology. Technology will always advance faster than oppression can keep it down. You put warning labels on tapes, on music and heavy metal and hip hop and rap, and people copy the tapes and distribute them. You ban videos, you ban horror movies from being sold in video stores or being sold in the marketplace. People copy them. You ban videos now, they get up on the internet. Technology is the silver bullet. Technology is the thing that always triumphs over censorship.
It's about the constant fear of what if. And I think especially when you become a parent, that comes into play a lot, because you're always, what if something were to happen? What if something was to happen to my child or yours or anybody else's? The people in society that need more protection than others. And there's a feeling that you want to take over and kind of control, or at least make safe. And make safe is an interesting term, because you say make safe, and yet making safe is not, it may be safe for you, but that's not safe for everybody else. In fact, that's just straight out controlling. And that's where I think a lot of the mindset was coming from within the idea to ban these films. You got to keep in mind too that these were not just typical horror films with the violence you would have already seen or expected to see. Blood that was in color and red and gore, I mean, that was sort of already there. People were they were expecting some of that was there. But this was balls out, like this was the stuff where you would just figure if somebody was dying by a knife or a machete, that's bad enough. But to have them then chopped up into pieces, or guts pulled out, and then somebody's eating the guts, and then you turn around and you cut off the head of the next person who's watching this happen, and I mean, that's just going for broke. You cut off the genitals and eat that penis, because everybody in Cannibal Land seems to want to eat the genitals. I don't know why, but anyway, so there's this idea that, like, it's not just a horror movie. It's not just what you might expect to see down in the cinema. It's no restrictions. It's balls out in your face, and whatever you can imagine would happen in these movies.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
What's great about Video Nasties, I think, is that it's something that does not exist at all anymore. Don't get me wrong, there's still censorship, but what we have now these days is ease of access to all these films. You can download them, you can buy them in shops. Half of them are now available in like Poundland.
Yeah, and I also think the audience's perception of what is gory and what is horrific, and also censorship itself, has completely changed now. Whereas you look back on Video Nasties of its day, and actually in today's comparison, they're kind of tame. And I think that's what we said that we were talking around, weren't we, about the fact that these films, some of them aren't the greatest of films, but they've become cult classics because they were labelled as Video Nasties.
I don't really think these films should have been banned. I mean, okay, they've got a rating, so you've got like an 18 rating on a film, that's fine. But they shouldn't have been outright banned. So it wasn't just children who weren't seeing these films, it was adults who were being told they couldn't watch the Video Nasties. So these were being banned from everybody. Not, the major thing was children might see these at home or whatever. But what about the adults? Can't they make their own mind up? That's what I really didn't get, is how they didn't even put like a rating on it or anything like that. Adults couldn't even make the decision to watch these films or not. So I really don't think these films should have been banned at all.
Perhaps they were seeing the title alone, and they were imagining in their mind what was happening in this movie, what could possibly be in this movie. And of course, you got to give it to the people making the box covers, because then you look at something like Driller Killer, and you see this drill going into the guy's head, and it's puncturing the skull, and it's drilling away, and all the blood is coming down, blood's coming down, the guy's screaming, and it's probably in his brain already. And you got to imagine that is God, if that's on the box cover, my God, what else could be in this movie?
The Last House on the Left. This film was on the banned Nasties list. It was rejected up until 2000, I think. I think they submitted again in 2000 and it was rejected. And then in 2003, they allowed a cut version to be released. And then in 2007, it was submitted again and they allowed it through uncut. I'm thinking, so when it was banned in 2000 and they said, no, you can't release this film, do they honestly believe that it was harmful then, but then 10 years later, or less than 10 years, they then allow it to be released fully uncut? And I mean, are they admitting that they were wrong, and that they're saying, well, you know, we were wrong, it's not actually a harmful film? It's illogical. It doesn't make any sense. And you know, I've seen all these films, and I don't go out killing people. Going back to the video nasties, the only thing which I do agree with being cut or censored is the animal cruelty, which comes into a lot of the Italian cannibal films, unfortunately. So stuff like Cannibal Holocaust, because that does, you know, that breaks the law. Animal cruelty is illegal, and it's, you know, you don't really want to watch it. So I agree that, like I said, anything that breaks the law shouldn't be allowed in a film. But when it comes to made up violence and, you know, fake effects and things like that, then there's no logical reason to keep banning that sort of thing, to keep censoring that sort of thing.
Video nasties I've always found a very interesting subject matter, because over the years I think a lot of the films that were considered video nasties are art films. They're actually really beautiful examples of how horror could enter the almost like the art mainstream. Now I know in a way that sounds like a contradiction, where a lot of people think art movies are like Ingmar Bergman or Antonioni or people like that, and of course those films are very artistic, but the reason is the Italians always took a very kind of blanket view of making a film, whereas they actually thought, and rightly so, that the visual aspect of making a film and the audio aspect should marry as a really beautiful thing. Even if the subject matter is dark, the Italians felt that the overall package should be beautiful, and I totally agree with that. I think film is a visual medium, and so unless you are creating something with a look that's meant to be deliberately grungy, because say it's like, you know, a mockumentary or a found footage film, then I think films should be beautiful no matter how dark the subject matter. So I suppose in a way that means that when I talk about video nasties, I'm really thinking of the Italian films that came out at the time. And of course, when I rented them as a boy on VHS, you know, I always remember that, going down to the VHS store and you'd find out the latest horror movie had come in from Italy or it had come in from the USA. And they weren't video nasties then, they were just the latest horror movie. And it's only in retrospect that these films are considered video nasties.
Horror films of the 1970s and the 80s are notorious primarily for their gore.
Yeah, of course.
I think it was a prime period for horror films. The style had changed way before then, from the kind of your gothic castles to the real world. Serial killers.
Your Chainsaw Massacre kind of films compared to your Dracula films or your Hammer horrors.
And then by the late 70s, you've got your zombie films.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're dealing then with two kind of extremes, aren't you? On the one hand, you've got your kind of gritty, realistic films like Last House on the Left. And then on the other hand, you've got your beyond fantastical films like Evil Dead.
But this was an issue really for the censors, that when these films like Last House on the Left came out, they were so real in their terms. They weren't monsters or vampires or zombies. No. They were real things happening.
And then that's where you could probably easily answer that question then. And it's hard for me to determine what should and shouldn't be banned. I think Gunnar Hansen once said, he finds it outrageous that a small group of people like the BBFC were able. All it is a small group of people who basically decide whether everyone else can watch them or not.
Yeah, that's true. And also you've got to think about the types of people. You've got middle class.
And and Video Nasty was a mass class divide, wasn't it?
Well, you had Mary Whitehouse for a start. She's an older lady. Yeah. Who was probably in her 70s, 60s, probably.
And she hadn't even seen
any of these horror films. And then she was dictating to people.
And you had James Furman say impact of Texas Chainsaw Massacre might not affect your everyday person, but it might affect, was it a working class member from Birmingham?
Yeah.
Like you. And so, going back on that sort of your super realistic horror films, because that's what it was, right? It was either serial killers.
Yeah.
I mean, you had your cannibal movies, but then you had your zombie movies. So if I was given the choice, right, one of these is more susceptible to being banned than the other, then in my eyes, because they're doing it is because of the effect it might have on the audience, and in this instance, their major worry was kids, then in all reality, the ones that should be looked at more would be your Last House on the Left, because you were literally. I mean, the thing is, Wes Craven, and I'll say this as a fan of the film, Wes Craven never set out to make Last House on the Left to glorify violence.
Or to be a banned film.
No, or to be a banned film, but it was his reaction to the Vietnam War and the fact that the TV was showing such violence. So, all right, we know that as fans of the film, and a lot of people do, that was his intent. The BBFC's perception of it is that it's glorifying violence. So ultimately, it's down to the violence, but Last House on the Left, you are kind of showing what could be a very real situation, which no doubt there has been situations like that. So if they had to make a decision on that, or Evil Dead, which was also on that same list, and Zombie Flesh Eaters, then that would be the one, at least I'd personally lean more towards, if there was ones to be banned.
But as you said, why is a small group of people banning those films? What was it about those particular films?
One of my memories of renting was when we got I Spit on Your Grave, and I watched it with two of my friends, probably around 12 or 13, and my dad walked in on the scene right where the rape was about to start, and he just sat down with us and started watching it, and we were like just laughing uncontrollably because we were just basically embarrassed. We didn't really know how to process it, and he just turned to us and said, "This isn't funny," and we just felt so stupid, but he ended up watching the whole thing with us.
I think that in a lot of ways the video rental store was sort of the gateway for the video nasty. I remember renting both Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave for the first time at a video store. I remember when I got Last House on the Left, I had to run it on my dad's rental account, because of course I wasn't old enough at the time. And the movie actually got eaten in his VCR. And I remember he got really upset and told me that this is what happens when you try watching old movies. So I'll always have that memory from watching Last House on the Left, renting it at a store. And then also I remember I Spit on Your Grave. At the time I was only 15, I think. And so I had to have an older friend rent it for me, actually. And he made me like a bootleg copy of it on video with photocopied art and everything, so I could watch it on my own anytime. Because at the time, that movie hadn't really been available here other than the Wizard release in America. You know, and obviously in the UK it was a video nasty, so it was practically impossible to legally find at the time. So I will always have those memories, and they definitely stick out, you know, for that reason.
Got so many favourite video nasties. I love Cannibal Ferox. That is one of my favourite ones. Really do love this film, Cannibal Ferox. I think this is actually a bootleg copy as well. I paid about 50 quid for this, but I don't remember. I actually remember years ago these did have a small box like this, but this one does look like a bootleg version. I think the actual label is far too shiny, if you can see that on there. So I actually think this is a bootleg, but this is actually, Cannibal Ferox is one of my favourite all-time video nasties. I love the actual soundtrack, the score. It was so shocking when you actually watch this film. I think it's the first time I remember seeing this as a bootleg copy, and it scared the shit out of me, this film. It's bloody brilliant. That haunting score, you know, you hear the music, this synth kind of prog rock music come up, the same part all throughout, and you know there's going to be a death scene or a killing scene. So I think one of my all-time favourites is Cannibal Ferox.
My favorite video nasty is probably, it's a tough call, but I'd probably say either The Evil Dead or Cannibal Holocaust, because, you know, those movies are really balls to the wall and really intense, and you take like The Evil Dead, that's a little more cartoony than Cannibal Holocaust would be, because Cannibal Holocaust is pretty much just a documentary but it's a fake documentary, but it's shot entirely like a documentary, so you're supposed to believe these things are real. And in The Evil Dead, you're not supposed to believe these things are real, you know what I mean? It's a very kind of far out there, tale of just gore and madness, you know what I mean? And Cannibal Holocaust is more along the lines of, this is what happens on the other side of the world type deal, which is scary because it's that unknown, and you'll probably never find yourself in a situation where you'd have to deal with that group of people, but it's still scary to know that they're out there type deal. You know what I mean?
I think for me, definitely Flesh for Frankenstein. As I had been watching all these horror movies, when I finally discovered that one, there was two films. There was that and Blood for Dracula, which are both Andy Warhol horror films. But they were borderline pornographic. And I think being a teenager, a pubescent teenager, starting to really get, I guess, interested in the other sex, and finding these movies that were sort of, borderline pornographic, but had the gore and the horror that I really loved. So definitely Flesh for Frankenstein, that'd be my favourite.
I would have to say my favorite is Absurd, and it's actually one of the latest entries in my findings. I first heard of it from the soundtrack and was immediately blown away by it. And as a film, it checks every box for Video Nasties. It's got the gore, and of course it's got the great score, but I mean the story is good. It's intriguing. It's actually one of the few that you don't have to check your watch and you don't have to fast forward. I mean, the story's intriguing and it keeps you entertained. It's definitely takes a lot from Halloween, but that's cool. And George Eastman rules, and it delivers on it checks every box.
I guess maybe around here we called them bootleg. The old VHSs back in the day. You'd see guys kind of selling them out of the trunk of a car. Some because they rip people off, and in some cases because they were too violent and sexually explicit. Now, this stuff was very sought after when I was a kid because there was no video on demand. There was no Amazon Prime or Vimeo, so people couldn't find these things. They had to exchange them. It's kind of creepy if you think about it. It's like a dark web of inappropriate VHS movies, but I think that really it really built up independent filmmaking in a big way. And I personally feel without some of the Video Nasties and how they were kind of exchanged almost illegally or illegally in some countries, some states, I think without that you wouldn't have seen such a surge of independent filmmakers who later did move on to the Hollywood level in the 90s. You saw a lot of people kind of get their start working on these movies that it was like so shocking. Everybody wanted to see it. It had either the insane gore effects or a sex scene that was, crazy for its time. Very low budget stuff. And, personally, the last couple movies I've done, such as, Witch Hunt and Parts Unknown, I think I've modeled a lot of what I've done as a director around some of these so-called Video Nasties because they were shot on much smaller budgets. I think the budget, it wasn't what was important. It was what was accomplished, and what was accomplished was creating almost this taboo situation where you can go and watch one of these things. You weren't seeing it in a theater. They were hard to find, hard to track down, and you had something that somebody didn't. And it wasn't just because it was a hard to get movie either. It was because it actually, had the sex and violence in it, and the good stuff that I think sometimes we don't get to see anymore. And as our society changes and becomes a little bit more, PC and we're not allowed to show stuff in film, I think there's going to be someday a big resurgence in this underground filmmaking. you know, and a way to bring this back for fans of this genre. I'd say anyone watching this is probably a fan of this genre, is to go and support the local horror conventions and, you know, some of the local people that set up shop at these small events, because, you know, they're the ones kind of selling this stuff now. You know, the Amazon Primes and all that stuff, that's cool, but, you know, what you're going to see on there, Netflix and all that, is probably more of what you've already seen. So, you know, I think hopefully someday we get to go back to this. You know, it might not be VHS, it might be on Blu-ray, but, you know, hopefully, you know, or even digital, but, you know, someday I hope there's a way to kind of trade these movies again. I think it's, it got a lot of people their start. It found a lot of fans. You know, so that's kind of my feeling about the importance of the so-called video nasties and what they did for people like me, who make low budget material.
I got into video nasties is around, must be in sort of 98, 99 time, when they were still banned, but it's right before James Furman left the BBFC, and all these films started to become unbanned and were starting to get certificates and stuff. And so I kind of got into the video nasties at a time when they, like I said, when they were still banned, and then I kind of saw the point when they started to get re-released. And when they were still banned, I remember I was at school, and a friend of mine, we would, you know, I've always had like an interest in horror films and extreme films, and so the video nasties was something that always fascinated me. And is that idea of, you know, these films that you shouldn't watch, they've been banned, you know, they're that somehow dangerous or whatever, that if you watch them it could be disturbing to you. And so that when you're at school or whatever, that just makes you want to find all these films. And around that time, a friend of mine, he came across an advert at the back of Darling Freead's newspaper magazine, if anyone remembers that, and someone was selling copies of The Exorcist. And so he sent off and asked him, you know, if he had any other tapes and stuff, and he sent him a whole list of. He had pretty much all the video nasties. He had loads of other obscure kind of cult, hard to find films, and that's where I basically started seeing these things. You know, we would spend. I think he used to do 2 for £10 or 2 for £15. So he put 2 films onto one tape. And so I used to start buying those. I think he got them all from like Laserdiscs and kind of preset copies. So that my first experience to the video nasties was just all through bootleg copies. But his ones were really good quality. I remember my friend also found another guy selling them, and they were like sort of 5th, 6th, 7th generation copies, and they were just like almost unwatchable. But this guy, who from the Diamond Freead's magazine, his stuff was always like amazing quality. I think they were all from Laserdiscs. He got them. And then around that time I actually started making bootlegs as well to sell on eBay. Like I said at the time, this is when they were still banned and stuff and you couldn't get them, and so I used to just make like copies used to get 4-hour tapes and put like 2 films that were kind of connected onto one tape and stick them on eBay and sell them for like £10, £15 a pop each time. You know, stuff like Cannibal Holocaust and Cannibal Ferox would go onto one tape, and Ice Spoon in the Grave and Last House on the Left would go on another tape. Occasionally you'd get complaints from people saying they didn't realise they were buying bootlegs and stuff, and your account would be closed down.
So, did I ever own any bootlegs of the video nasties? God, yes! I tell you, this is a really great story. In about 96, 97, this is before the internet was really big. Email might have been used by some people that I knew. But in 96 to 97, I started doing mail trading of movies on VHS, where we would send dupes. So you would have, through email, you would make contacts with people. I guess they did have websites up, which is really how you would find people. But they were into trades. So somebody would have their list of what movies they had, and you would have a list of what movies you had, and we would swap lists. And of course we'd make a deal. You say, well, geez, I really would love to get this, 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 and this. And then the guy on the other end would pick the same amount of movies from your list. You would make the copies. If you were a reputable trader, you would buy brand new videotapes and make the copies onto those. I guess some people might have used previously used blank tapes, which was the shittiest thing to do for somebody. But anyway, you buy blank tapes, copy the movie you had, so you're making like you're making your third or fourth generation movie onto a fifth or sixth generation movie because everybody's trading a dupe of a dupe of a dupe of a dupe, you know, and then you mail them in the mail. Well, this went on for me for a few years, and I got like so many movies through the mail trading. Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, Beyond the Darkness, I got that one. I got everything you can say. Uncut Friday the 13th Part 1. These were all the movies that were not on DVD at all yet. They were not being re-released and remastered. They were still on very ropey old tapes. Another company I'm aware of was, of course, Midnight Video. They were selling them at the time. Well, a lot of people that I knew had that movie or Midnight movie tapes, and they were making dupes of that to trade. So I got like Anthropophagus and stuff, and the Midnight Video Anthropophagus was made up of different sources. So when it came time to see George Eastman reach into the woman and pull out the fetus to eat her, that particular piece of footage was coming in this very, very washed out, blurry piece of video, and then it would cut back to the sort of washed out video where you saw the rest of the movie. So you had different composites put together.
So yeah, you know, I remember when I was a kid, the thing that, you know, the one in you know, the United States, everybody wanted to see Faces of Death. You know, that was the big thing. You know, if you had a VHS of Faces of Death, you were like a king. You know, you go into a party and be like, hey, I bought this off of some dude on the street, and everybody would gather around a TV to watch, you know, this. I have no idea if that's actually real or not. I feel like it's mixed, but, you know, it was just that suspense, I think, really paved the way for things like, you know, the Blair Witch, the found footage films, you know, that excitement of, you know, I'm seeing something that nobody's supposed to see, and I think it really captured what, you know, independent film is supposed to be, and not, you know, a system of like Hollywood B, which is what we kind of get on a lot of the video on demand services.
One of the next things that I have here is actually my bootleg copy of Tenebrae. This was a copy of the video media release here, as you can see, but it's a totally photocopied, you know, cover art. And also something interesting about it, you see here maybe, is that it's got the British rating there on it instead of the American one, so it's sort of all over the place here, but this is the way I first saw the film. It's what introduced me to not only Dario Argento's movies, but Italian movies as well. And that scene at the end with the girl that gets her arm chopped off and sprays blood all over the wall was sort of life-changing for me, because that's the moment when I realized that horror is art. And this movie will always stand out to me for that reason. So even though this is a bootleg copy, and I of course have better versions of it to watch, I'm always going to hold on to this, because this is sort of what started my love for Italian horror, was this very bootleg release of Tenebrae.
I did own one banned film. I remember in Melbourne, Victoria, there weren't a lot of films banned. I mean, The Driller Killer was, I think Silent Night, Deadly Night perhaps. Some of these films you could get interstate. But I remember a friend of mine coming to me knowing how much I adored horror, and he'd been to the States, and he picked me up a copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And I remember that was banned, you know, so I was kind of like the only guy I knew that had this videotape, and so it sort of attracted a lot of friends to come over and watch it. And that was a banned film, so it's probably the only one that I really owned at the time that was that had a lot of stigma.
I did own a lot of the bootleg copies because I was on a quest to try and own all of the video nasties. So I literally did own a hell of a lot. I still do now. So I've got a lot of the bootleg copies and stuff like that. So I had these tapes and they were stuck on the side, and I handwritten Driller Killer on there and Snuff and stuff like that on there.
Yes, I owned several bootlegs actually of these movies because, you know, growing up back then they weren't that accessible. You couldn't just walk into a Best Buy or, you know, a Big Lots and buy a movie like this. You had to track them down. You had to do your research. Usually they were second, third, fourth, fifth generation copies. They were squibbly and grainy and looked like crap, and you could barely tell what was happening sometimes, but it was in a lot of ways really cool because you knew that this was the only way to see the movie. You were seeing something that not everybody else saw.
So that they were a big thing, the bootleg copies, because they were just going around. I mean, when I was a kid in teenage years, it was bootleg copies. You never saw a real copy of a video nasty. So from probably like 85 to even to about 2000, 2001, you had these bootleg VHS copies and bootleg DVD copies in circulation. So you're watching these. Sometimes it was like a 5th generation bootleg of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre you were watching, or something like that.
And it's funny because I think it's given me a really high tolerance for low quality transfers, because I just grew up watching a lot of bootleg horror movies. Now it doesn't bother me. I can watch really terrible stuff on YouTube and I won't blink an eye. I think it's just part of growing up watching those bootlegs, and it's still sort of exciting. You know, if I'm at a flea market now or a garage sale and I find a bootleg of an old horror movie, I definitely snatch it up. Just, it's nostalgic, it's really cool and unique, and it's fun and exciting to watch a movie that way sometimes. It adds a lot, you know, to the mystique of the movie.
See Jimmy Lane as Reno Miller, a man driven to the very edge. And then beyond. The Driller Killer is coming.
The Driller Killer, when it came out, I remember, was a very controversial film because they had all this rumor going on at the time that when Abel Ferrara made that film and starred in it, that he was actually killing down and outs, because, you know, the people in the film really looked like down and outs. Some of them probably were, and they were paid a few dollars, you know, to become a part of this movie. And I always found that very disturbing. For years after seeing it and then experiencing it again over the years and the decades, I've still found it a very troubling film. And I think because it's incredibly realistic on one aspect and then a little over the top on others in terms of performance. The performance of Abel Ferrara himself is it's mixed, you know, it's very strong at times, and then it's so wild, it's like, do I quite believe that? But it was shot in such a lurid style that you couldn't help be sucked into that grimy, horrible underworld. And then when the murders happened, you were like, oh my god, like, is this happening for real? So in a way, it kind of, even though it's not found footage, it kind of feels like a mockumentary style film, which would have been one of the first of that kind. Yeah, Driller Killer is a film that's always stayed with me for its level of violence, grungy atmosphere, and general feeling of dismay and overall horror.
Faces of Death, now a major motion picture.
Faces of Death, the mother of all Mondo movies. Oh boy, where to start with this one? In a nutshell, it's a documentary about dying. It's pretty tame compared to what a lot of people think about it. A lot of people think it's a flat-out snuff movie that you see real people getting murdered on video, and that's not at all what it is. It's got a narrator. He basically discusses the whole cycle of life and, you know, what really happens to us when we pass on, and they examine it throughout, you know, different cultures, and they look at the different traditions that different people, you know, do around death in their own cultures. It's got some pretty notorious scenes, like a man, you know, that is caught on fire. I think that the original movie's the movie with the monkey brains. You know, there's quite a few scenes that really make this movie stand out, but it's notorious for being mostly fake. A lot of the stuff was staged, just come to light now, you know, throughout various documentaries and information on the internet, that they reenacted, you know, a lot of the stuff. I think that the scene that takes place in the Middle East with the monkey is supposed to be based on a tradition somewhere in Russia. And so they changed a lot of things, I think, to not offend certain cultures when the movie came out. But to me, the whole movie is just a big spectacle. The fear surrounding the movie with parents, the fact that you couldn't find it everywhere, you had to ask for it at some places, or it was in a special section with the other death movies or pornography even. You know, you had to be 18 to get it. That always really appealed to me. It makes the movie probably more exciting than it really is to watch. Because, I mean, like I said, it's a pretty by-the-numbers 70s documentary. It's just focused on death. And I think that even today, it's the type of thing you could probably, like, show to a high school class, and nobody would bat an eye. Everybody would be on their phones watching something more extreme on YouTube. You know, so it's funny, because to me, those movies always stick out and sort of be the most extreme, but by today's standards, they're almost, you know, a joke. But I think that that whole series, you know, really stands out against the other video nasties, just because it's sort of the real deal, and it was the first of its kind when it came out.
I remember another series of video nasties which was quite horrific at the time, to be quite frank. Faces of Death, do you remember those? And it's a series of films, video films, with apparently people actually dying. I wouldn't want to watch them now, and it actually turns me stomach to think I even watched them back then. But it was one I remember, and it was a chap in a gas chamber, and you actually had the cameraman in the gas chamber. And then I thought, even as a kid, hold on, this can't be right. So because then it turned out a lot of them were fake film. There was another one of a magician, and it supposedly goes wrong. He's trying to cut himself out of something, and these knives come down and go into his head, and he dies. And it's so obvious that it was a rubber head or something, or plastic or wax head. But then you had some what still appear to me genuine footage of people dying. There's one terrible scene where a chap gets out of a car in Africa somewhere, and he's filming this lioness, and they cut to actually him filming it on a cine camera. And then this other lion comes up from behind him and attacks him and kills him, and all the people are screaming, and then they have the footage of him being put in the car in a body bag. So that was pretty horrific. So I wouldn't want to watch them again, I don't think.
So the sickest video nasty, I would say the craziest, gory, sickest one out of the lot would be Faces of Death.
Now, a motion picture dares to take you beyond the threshold of the living, where you may discover your own face of death.
I think that film is really sick. I mean, is there real killings in that film or not? I don't know, because I've never actually got the whole way through it. I've put it on before, but it actually turns my stomach. There was that big thing in the 80s where they were deemed to be eating monkey brains, and we've got prime ministers, MPs sitting there saying they're eating monkey brains, for God's sake, in that. They weren't. It was all fake anyway, which is totally crazy. But Faces of Death, it has to be the sickest, crazy film. I think the film that you'd crown the king of the video nasty would be I Spit on Your Grave. That poster art, that whole cover is synonymous of being the queen of the video nasty. It's such an amazing film. It really is brilliant.
Faces of Death was actually created for the Japanese film market. It was a movie called Junk. It was released there that way, and they kind of tested it with American audiences and caught on, so they dropped it on home video and ended up becoming a really popular American series known as Faces of Death. A lot of people also don't know that almost every installment in the film was released in a different version in other countries. Notoriously, Faces of Death 3, it's not actually on the list, but it's a sequel to the original. That was released as Fear in most parts of Europe, and it had a completely different narrator, totally different scenes. It was edited completely different. In some ways, it's a lot better than the American version, that came out. Of course, there's several versions that were released of Last House on the Left. America first got the R-rated version when it came out to theaters, but then we did eventually get the uncut version on home video, even though it was still missing a lot of the gore that Wes Craven had shot. It was still, a little bit longer than, what the UK got, for example.
Definitely Faces of Death would have to be, the most sadistic. I mean, when I first heard the name, it was almost like this kind of taboo fear factor. Someone would say, Faces of Death, have you seen it? And people would go, no, don't watch that. It was supposed to be terrifying. I think because, it was really a documentary, and it was the first sort of video footage that came out in the 80s where apparently, you could see these real deaths. Of course, there was skepticism, and some people thought they were staged or whatnot, but the Faces of Death really, for at least where I was living, they were supposed to be the most the scariest and the most taboo. So just based on the reputation of those, there was a whole spawn of documentaries that came out. I remember there was Savage Man, Savage Beast, Shocking Asia, there was Being Different, there was The Killing of America, there was this whole range, Savage Man, Savage Beast. So it was really a period in the 80s where I guess horror film became so popular. Then then they went into kind of documentary stream, and it was almost like trying to find the scariest, or trying to find the most impact with the kind of gore factor. That's what people were after. It was almost those people that had an obsession, and so they wanted to get as nasty as they could. And of course now everything's reality TV. So even the documentaries back then, I think they were onto something.
One of the most violent other than Faces of Death in the video nasties, would probably be Cannibal Holocaust. I mean, there's a lot of violent movies on the list, but that's the one that really, you know, pushed the envelope at the time and was notorious for its graphic nature. The impalement, you know, through the woman's anus and out of her mouth is pretty iconic now as far as horror imagery goes. And I think that that would probably have to go down as probably the most sickest of the banned films, you know, followed closely by movies like Faces of Death.
Every time I watch it, it just makes me say, God damn, this fucking movie goes all the way. I mean, Grindhouse Releasing had the perfect tagline. It's the one that goes all the way. But it's a good piece of cinema. It's a fucking good movie. And it deserves to be seen by a lot more people, but I think a lot of people hear the stories and of course the animal torture stuff and the animal killings, and it's a tough movie, but it deserves to be, you know, it deserved to be on that list. It's one that deserved to be on that list as far as being, you know, making sure that young kids don't see it. You know, the rape and all that. It's a tough movie.
Yeah, I got to admit there are films on the list of video nasties that I really couldn't watch today.
Oh, good Lord! It's unbelievable. It's horrible. I can't understand the reason for such cruelty.
Cannibal films, I've no interest in watching those. I don't like the idea of innocent people being tortured and ripped apart and eaten alive, and, you know, it's just not something that appeals to me.
I wouldn't say that there's any films in particular I couldn't stomach, but perhaps there's scenes I can't stomach. I've noticed as I get older, it's just getting increasingly harder for me to be able to keep my eyes on the screen during the excessive gore. In particular, the scene in Cannibal Holocaust, you know, where it shows the woman impaled, that's pretty hard to look at. Obviously, being a guy, the scene in I Spit on Your Grave, where she takes the guy's manhood. It doesn't actually show anything, but that's definitely something that is very hard as a guy to watch. And also, in Zombie Flesh Eaters, of course, the notorious scene with the eyeball, the splinter in the eyeball. I don't know how anybody could watch that scene, you know, without covering their eyes, because it's torture as her eye gets closer and closer and closer to that splinter. It's like, oh my God, turn your head, what are you doing? It's very hard to watch, and then it pierces and it's disgusting, and in typical Lucio Fulci fashion, it doesn't cut away right away. So it's very hard to watch. But it's still an enjoyable movie. All of these movies are really enjoyable, even if I have to cover my eyes through parts of them.
No, I wish there was. I mentioned Cannibal Holocaust, but I mean, like I said, I got desensitized to it. But there's really nothing that does it to me anymore. So no, I wish there was, though. I wish I was. And I say that because I know some of these films, if I can imagine, like, some certain friends seeing, you know, would have that, I would envy that feeling they would get, but I just don't get it anymore.
I think the film I couldn't stomach has to be, well, Faces of Death is one of them I couldn't stomach, but Cannibal Holocaust, watching that film turned my stomach. It's such a good horror film. It's a great video nasty and a great horror film, but it actually turned my stomach, because there's a scene in there where they're killing a turtle, and it just makes me, even now I put that on, and it'll just make me reach. My stomach will turn when I know it's coming up to that scene. So I think, yeah, Cannibal Holocaust and Faces of Death, even now they make me feel queasy even thinking about them. Both really amazing films, but really, really sick.
I think Cannibal Holocaust, you know, I mean, a friend of mine had a re-release on DVD, and he put it on, and I was kind of like, okay, we'll go back there, we'll have a look. But I really just felt sick. I was kind of not really, you know, probably now being a grown man, you know, it wasn't scary, it was a bit more sadistic, and I think that was really a movie that just, you know, was a little bit disturbing. It just didn't really have, you know, much of a clean narrative that I like. I mean, for me, film is definitely an escape. I love fiction, so I think that one was almost sort of borderline real, and it just kind of made me feel sick.
So yeah, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of my all-time favourite video nasties. The strange thing with that film is, I remember watching another bootleg version for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it was really fuzzy. Before I watched that film, I felt scared because I knew something really bad was going to happen. Everyone was talking about this film. But the crazy thing is, in the actual film, there's hardly any blood and hardly any gore at all. In fact, there's basically none. Everything we see happens off screen. I mean, right, you see him grab Pam and stick her up on the hook, but you don't see anything else. You don't see any incisions of hooks and blood and heads coming off and guts or anything like that. A lot of that film is what you don't see that is actually scary with that film. And to me, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the all-time best, not just video nasties, but one of the best horror films of all time. So for me, you get that kind of film and you think, why would you ban a piece of art? Because that's what they were doing. They were banning pieces of art with these films.
So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2 siblings and 3 of their friends en route to visit their grandfather's grave in Texas end up falling victim to a family of cannibalistic psychopaths. Yeah, look, when I saw Texas, it was by a company called Filmways, and I think the whole thing about it was that it was based on a true story. That was the biggest fear factor. It's interesting now seeing filmmakers like Nicholas Winding Refn. He thinks it's his favourite film as well. And I was very lucky to obviously have met Gunnar and also received a copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre signed by Tobe Hoover himself for my 30th birthday. So the movie really resonated with me. That was one of the films that, again, it was kind of almost slash doco style. It was very raw, very gritty, and kind of changed the face of cinema as far as horror goes. So definitely, a big thumbs up for me. It'd be in my top 4 for sure.
I think I've got this is the German copy, this one. So this is the German copy of the Video Nasty. I actually really like this cover art. You've got a Chainsaw Massacre going to this woman. It looks bloody brilliant.
Great film from that list to me is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the hellish time Tobe Hooper had in trying to get that film made in one of the hottest summers ever in the US, with stinking, rotting meat on set. I'm sure the experience of making that film was a video nasty in itself. Because a lot of them were throwing up in the heat of the day with the smell of the interiors and all the rotting flesh, that they had to keep filming. And of course, in those days, they weren't using digital; they were actually shooting on 16mm. So they knew that if they wasted any film or they wasted any time, then then they may not get to finish their film. And the funders were very, they leaned on them strongly to make sure that they got the film made within the time, on budget, and hopefully ended up with something that they could sell or that they could exploit in cinemas. And as we know, it became a massive hit.
After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
I'm not sure it was ever considered a video nasty in the USA, but of course, when it came out in Britain and Ireland, it quickly became part of that list, and which is quite amusing about it. That film contains more psychological violence than physical violence. Even though there is physical violence in it, a lot of it is off screen, and that is very interesting to me. That it goes to show that you don't need to show the really nasty stuff, you just need to suggest it, and then the audience are deeply disturbed. Because there's nothing more powerful than the human mind and the human imagination. If you pull away from what's happening and then leave it up to the audience member to decide what it is that happened in that moment and how it came about, then you find that they walk away with their own idea of the worst possible scenario. And that's an example, I think, of cinema today, where you don't need to show everything in order to have that great effect.
Another fairly obscure release I have of a not so obscure movie would be the Wizard Video release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This was the first version of the movie I got. This is the way that I saw the film when it first came out. It's a very murky, dark, grainy print, but a lot of people would argue that's the only way to see this movie. I know now that this tape is worth quite a bit. It goes on eBay for a lot of money, and it's fully intact. It's got, as you can see, all the flaps there. It's in really good condition still, but it's definitely not something I'm going to let go of. I mean, it's the very first release of probably my all-time favorite movie, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it's definitely one that I cherish and will always have in my collection of awesome VHS movies.
Stop! Stop!
craziest memory would have to be, I think I was like grade 6, Form 1 in school. I was quite young. And, you know, I loved horror so much. At school, they used to call me the gore freak because I had a fascination with the gore and the effects. It was probably not so much the fear factor of these movies, but I was really interested in how the makeup worked. So I was always trying to find really gross makeup effects, like in your Extro and a lot of these movies. So sort of pushed it to the next limit. I had a mate of mine at school. We used to like watch a lot of these horror films, and we'd go into the video store, and he knew because I was the gore freak that I'd probably pick a good film. So I introduced him to The Evil Dead, and I said to him, look, if you really want to test your kind of your stamina for this sort of stuff, we're going to drink milk. And he said to me, why am I drinking milk during this film? I said, just have a glass of milk there, because then when the demon started to spurt blood, which was white, I was trying to make him vomit. So that was the test, drinking milk whilst watching Evil Dead, trying to make my friend vomit. So it was that's how far we used to go.
Well, it definitely affected me. It's the core inspiration for my cinema therapy video nasties mix, Forbidden Horrors and Dirty Sin Scores. It was me going down this rabbit hole of finding these films that made me realize the core connection was all the score, the music. The tie-in was the music. I mean, the 30 Cents and the funky disco and the prog rock. When I was looking for a new project to compile for a VJ mix, I was it was perfect because I didn't really know about the controversy until I started putting together the pieces of these films and what they meant to me, and which was basically the music. It was the music that drove me to find these films.
Now, A Spit on Your Grave definitely had a high impact on me. It was brutal. It was a feared movie when it came out. Highly inspired my movie Tomboys, my film Tomboys, which is really 5 girls that kidnap a serial rapist to seek revenge. Again, sort of, you know, loosely based on a true story. The funny thing I found out afterwards was that the director actually married the lead in that movie. Her name's Jennifer Hill, which is also my mother's name. So that was kind of a little bit kind of creepy, and I had an affinity to it. But definitely, you know, right up there in my top 4.
I think the video nasties have influenced a lot of my work, down to Grindsploitation, VHS Lives, down to Toxic Schlock, the crazy comedy horror. It's really influenced a lot of my work.
As far as censorship, I don't really agree with censorship per se. I'm more of a believer in having a good disclaimer which lists some of the content that the viewer will be watching when they put that film on. Some nights for dinner you may be okay with necrophilia, but others, you know, you may not. So sometimes the subject matter may not be what even the most hardened horror fan is ready for at that particular time. So just having a good disclaimer is really all that you need, so that the viewer is making the decision. It's in our hands what we want to watch, how far we want to take it. And then there's no creative expression that's taken away from the artist behind the film. There's no watering down of the message that they intended to put out there, which was their reasoning behind making the film in the first place.
Italy had a tradition of extreme movies, especially in the 70s and 80s. And most of them are big part of the list of the video nasties. So titles like Anthropophagus, Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, or House by the Cemetery, just for say some title. Those are some of the masterpieces that gets banned and forbidden from many countries. Also, it surprised me to find amazing titles also like Driller Killer or Flesh of Frankenstein. I think censorship is something really that doesn't have reason to exist, because yes, it's good to protect child, protect people that is not ready or able to see and watch this kind of movies, but people must have the freedom to choose what you watch, to enjoy what to want to enjoy, and discover what needs to discover, especially thinking that some titles now are considered masterpiece. We are able to watch on TV and internet every kind of murder and accident and disaster, but there is someone that believe that a movie can be much more dangerous than watch these kind of programs and news on TV.
I mean, the real question is, how do you actually legislate morality? Where is there a line in the sand that you can draw for a massive group of people that applies to every single person's own personal line where they decide something is decent and something is not decent? You can't do it. It's a subjective thing. So to unnaturally enforce this line where you say this is appropriate, you know, you can watch The Crying Game, but you can't watch The Hills Have Eyes, right? I don't know. It's a fallacy. You can't do it because everyone has their own taste. Everyone has to decide on their own what is appropriate, what is over the line. That's our right as people, that's our right as consumers, that's our right as patrons of whatever art form we want to patronize. To arbitrarily put this line here where you're saying everything on this side of this is forbidden from you, it doesn't work.
Nothing should be censored other than for children, and that's up to the parents to keep the children away.
Censorship.
The time of the video Nasties is a weird time. It was almost like if you had like what we thought was a really cool cover to your movie, it would instantly, you know, get put on this list. So basically, you had movies that were basically art house films like Driller Killer, which, see, that cover is awesome. We think that's awesome, but there's little of that actually in the film. What you get is a character piece of a man slowly going insane for various reasons, and all justifiable reasons. The way he vents is kind of a little questionable. Like, he buys a drill with its own power pack, and it just goes in the streets and starts like taking out homeless people with it. But that's well into the movie. Before that, you see fantastic scenes like when he and his lesbian roommates, they order pizza, a large pizza. You get to see him, Reno, played by director Abel Ferrara, consume this entire pizza, this entire large pizza by himself. And you see many art house moments like that in Driller Killer, which was clearly labeled a video nasty just for the cover alone.
I think censorship will be moving in a good direction in the future, which means it will be more lax. There's going to be more avenues just every day for the artists to get their art out there to the fans directly, going hand in hand and having that connection and cutting out the bigger companies and some of the other sources that get in the middle and kind of, you know, meddle in our entertainment where they don't belong. I think also the calling for having the ability to watch a video nasty, take your aggression out on entertainment, you know, throw up, cry, scream, but it's all at your screen. We have the message, we know it's happening, you know, in our neighborhoods, in our towns, but the ability to press pause or stop and then just come back to it and revisit, you can still handle it as, you know, an entertainment level type thing instead of just watching the news and having that reality in your face. It's having more control as a viewer, and it's having more control as a human being in general. And there's going to be more calling for it as we move forward. And the mindset that people are in these days, we need those outlets. And as long as we need them, they're going to get stronger and they're going to flow in the direction of, you know, the voice of the people.
I was watching those movies long before I knew what video nasties even were, like Friday the 13th. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all those type movies that were banned on the list. They were banned over there, censored, so you couldn't even get them over there. Luckily, we were over here in the States. We watched them over here and that kind of thing. And over there, you would have to get them probably on bootleg and that kind of thing. I'm not really sure, but I think that's what it was over there. Possibly probably order them through a merchandise video catalog, probably. But I remember the video Nasties, man. Like there's some really good ones, like Cannibal Holocaust. I remember watching that later, way later. I was like, 13 watching that. I didn't even know it was Video Nasty at the time. I found out through research through Fangoria what Video Nasties were. I would see the term Video Nasties, but I didn't really know what that really was. And I did research, and I'm like, it's like this list of these movies that were banned. But a pretty cool list. Looks at movies on there that I would use for research to find at video stores over here also. Like the Don't Drip Blood and things like that were on that list. And Evil Speak, I believe, and that kind of stuff. I would use that as a list, as a guideline and stuff, so I could find these movies at video shops. But the ones I like, the ones I remember the most getting were like, so Cannibal Holocaust, crazy movie. Extra, which is really weird, especially the part where the dude's like getting born, like he's kind of coming out of this weird alien birth and stuff. It's just really strange. It's all slimy coming out of there and stuff. It's like ew, but it's really cool.